We will be presenting about the changes in North Carolina criminal procedural law. I'm Katie.
I'm Joseph.
I'm Niharika.
I'm Vraj.
The following information pertains to recent changes in the court's criminal procedure, which encompasses pretty much everything from when warrants are first issued, when an investigation first begins, when witnesses are first questioned, all the way until a verdict is decided, and even beyond that to determine what does sentencing look like, what does the treatment of people in prison look like, and all of that. And criminal procedure is therefore one of the most important parts of criminal law. In particular, we will be going over the recent changes in 4 different areas of criminal procedure. The first one is court jurisdiction, which is what kind of procedural rules does the court have to follow, in what kind of situations is the court able to exercise its authority. The second is Miranda rights, which, as all of you know, are the rights that anybody brought in for questioning is read to make sure that they don't self-incriminate and understand all of their rights under the Bill of Rights. The third is warrants, which is a very critical part, especially under the Fourth Amendment, of how is evidence obtained, how do we have a standard of evidence that allows for fair trials and for fair prosecutions. The fourth is juvenile rights, which is a subsection of kind of the general idea of Miranda rights and criminal procedures. So it focuses on how do juveniles understand the law, how do they understand Miranda rights because they're juveniles and they aren't really full adults and don't have that kind of power to have self-agency in the situation. And criminal procedure is extremely important because it establishes this set of rules that the court has to adhere to make sure we're having fair cases, that our judicial system has a standard to follow. And if the steps of these crucial processes are not followed or carried out properly, then cases can be dismissed and judgments can be vacated because evidence was dismissed or sentencing was not allowed because it was considered unfair under the Eighth Amendment. So by following criminal procedure and especially staying up to date on the changes in these 4 areas, court jurisdiction, Miranda rights, warrants, and juvenile rights, we will be able to better avoid letting the guilty walk free and making sure that our judicial system is up to par and that we are better equipped to follow the procedural rules of the judicial system.
The first case is the NC State Bar versus Tillett. This case was about the North Carolina Disciplinary Hearing Commission. They tried to investigate and punish a sitting judge for a crime committed before he was actually appointed to that judgeship. And so the case was brought before the court to decide whether the DHC actually had this authority and jurisdiction to investigate and punish a sitting judge. When the actual DHC was created, their primary reason for creation was investigating and punishing a judge after the judge had been disbarred. So this case was inevitably set for the precedent, the fact that the DHC did not have the authority to do their own private investigation and to punish a judge who is sitting on the bench at the time. So they do not have this authority according to the holding. The authority is of the jurisdiction of the North Carolina Supreme Court or the North Carolina Judicial Standards Commission. So these 2 entities both have the right to investigate through the court system about the actual sitting judge for crimes before they have been appointed to the bench or during their time on the bench. And then after the actual judge is disbarred, then the DHC comes in with their own authority to punish the judge further. So basically, with your being applicable to your daily legal lives, you have to notice that if any judge is being investigated by the North Carolina Disciplinary Hearing Commission prior to being removed, if there's already an investigation by the North Carolina Supreme Court or the Judicial Standards Commission, then you know that the DHC does not have the right to do that, and then their investigation can be thrown out of court. So just know that the DHC does not have the jurisdiction to actually investigate and punish a sitting judge. The second case is State versus Ledbetter. So in this case, the NC Rules of Appellate Procedure were taken to be applicable to the situation at hand. A female had been accused of drunk driving, so she pled guilty to driving while impaired. But in her plea, she made sure that there was a clause stating that she still had the right to appeal to dismiss the charges. So she reserved the right through the plea to be able to appeal it to the Court of Appeals. So the North Carolina Court of Appeals denied her request for the writ of certiorari, and they said that they had this right through Rule 21 of the North Carolina Rules of Appellate Procedure, which defines certiorari and the avenues of which someone can appeal to the Court of Appeals. Also, the case came about when the North Carolina's Court of Appeals was basically stated that they weren't allowed to deny her writ of certiorari because they didn't have the discretionary authority because of Rule 1. But the Rule 1 does not apply specifically to Rule 21 of the NC Rules of Appellate Procedure, and the North Carolina Court of Appeals denied the right to suspend the rules through Rule 2 of the NC Rules of Appellate Procedure, which, because of their high standards of getting rid or suspending the rules. So in the absence of a procedural rule explicitly allowing review, such as here in this case, the Court of Appeals should turn to common law and aid in exercising its discretion rather than automatically denying the petition for the writ of certiorari or requiring that the heightened standards set out in Rule 2 be satisfied. So basically, this quote sums up the ending of the case to the fact that the court has both the jurisdiction and discretionary authority with the issuance of a writ of certiorari, either way to allow the writ to go through by issuing it or denying the request for the review. So in your common practice, the Court of Appeals does have discretionary authority and jurisdiction to deny and issue writ of certiorari through this specific avenue to appeal a process through the court.
State v. Hammonds is a case regarding criminal procedure, more specifically Miranda rights. In this case, Taekwon Hammonds was found guilty of armed robbery. Hammonds intentionally overdosed on drugs and was involuntarily committed to a hospital. While at the hospital, Hammonds was questioned for about 90 minutes or so without being read his Miranda rights. During this interrogation, he elicited self-incriminating evidence. The North Carolina Supreme Court had to determine whether he was subject to a custodial interrogation during this period by looking at two essential elements. Ultimately, the court ruled that he was subject to a custodial interrogation, and thus he should have been Mirandized, so his conviction was ultimately vacated. When deciding if a client's rights have been violated because proper Miranda procedure was not followed, it is important to examine two essential elements to determine whether someone is subject to a custodial interrogation. The first element is the circumstances surrounding the interrogation, and the second element is whether a reasonable person would feel as if he or she could end the questioning and simply just leave. While representing your client, it is crucial to determine whether either one of these circumstances applies so you can determine whether your client has potentially experienced a Miranda rights violation, just like Hammonds did. The details of Hammonds spell out what will and what will not be deemed acceptable. While your client is explaining their story to you, it is important to consider, did they or any reasonable person feel that they could leave? Additionally, did the client, or again, any reasonable person, feel that they could stop answering questions or that they were free to state that they didn't want to continue? If the client felt coerced into answering any of these questions and they were not read their Miranda rights, it is most likely a violation of procedure. JDB v. North Carolina further enforces what custodial interrogation entails. In this case, the court ruled that the main determination in deciding whether someone is subject to a custodial interrogation is the objective circumstances of the interrogation. In determining Hammonds, the North Carolina Supreme Court used the same reasoning as it did here. Hammonds did not necessarily think it was an interrogation. He thought he was just getting asked some questions and would be able to leave once he answered all the questions. If perhaps somebody asked him, "Do you think you were interrogated?" it is unknown what he would have answered. However, the objective facts were, Hammonds did not feel that he could leave, and he felt that he needed to answer the questions in order to leave. Therefore, it is crucial for lawyers to determine the objective facts in the situation that their client was involved in. The objective facts determine whether their client was indeed in a custodial interrogation and not the subjective thoughts of the process. It is ultimately the objective facts that are important in the determination of a custodial interrogation. In United States v. Walker, Anthony Walker was pulled over for reckless driving, whereupon a firearm was found in his car. Police officers read him his Miranda rights, and Walker waived them. Upon trial, Walker's argument was that he was too intoxicated to waive his rights and was not made in full awareness. The Fourth Circuit found no reason to rule that intoxication is sufficient to render a Miranda waiver ineffective. Therefore, the court reasoned that Walker's waiver was made knowingly and intelligently. The reasoning that the court used for Walker was very, very vague. Thus, it is important for lawyers to know that the law isn't very clear in these conditions. The only reasoning that the Fourth Circuit was able to give was that Walker's intoxication was obvious, not extreme. Therefore, Walker was sober enough to know where he was and recognize the people around him. The court made a judgment call on whether he was aware enough to legally waive his Miranda rights. There is not an established bar to determine a level of intoxication that can render Miranda rights ineffective. When a client approaches a lawyer, it is crucial for a lawyer to ask their client questions such as, were you slurring your words? Were you having difficulty following commands? Did you understand what the police officers were saying? The answers to these questions can give clues to determine whether their client was able to make an informed decision to waive their Miranda rights. Because no law has been set in stone, there's a lot of wiggle room in the future for cases that come up. As an attorney, it is important to understand that since there are no hard and fast rules, you must try and determine your client's state of mind during the questioning. Were they able to knowingly waive their rights? If as an attorney one can show that their client was impaired, then it is possible to have the case vacated on procedural error. Attorneys must examine the totality of the circumstances that their client was in so they can make a judgment call on whether they think the court will rule in their client's favor or not. Basically, was their client sober enough to make their decision in full awareness?
State v. Perry is a drug trafficking case. The defendant, Paul Perry, was first implicated via a set of text messages, and the information garnered by these text messages, however, was not enough to obtain a warrant for real-time tracking, so the police filed a warrant to track him using historical location data sent periodically by his cell phone provider whenever a call was made to or from the device. The police were soon able to track Perry to a motel with large quantities of heroin. In trial court, Perry moved to suppress information obtained by the historical tracking warrant, arguing that the historical location data was protected under what is considered to be under the reasonable expectation of privacy by the Fourth Amendment, and therefore the warrant did not have sufficient probable cause. The trial court and the Court of Appeals both denied this motion on the grounds that historical location data was information involuntarily surrendered by the defendant to a cell phone provider and subsequently accessed by the police. This case does set a dangerous precedent by the Court of Appeals, as it greatly increases the police's ability in how they can track individuals that they deem worthy of suspicion. It allows warrants to be issued without strong probable cause, as would otherwise be required by a real-time tracking warrant, and it allows warrants to be issued with only circumstantial evidence, such as an indicating set of text messages, as per this case. The court's definition of historical data is nominal only as well. A 5 to 7 minute delay, as per the case, is not really a hindrance for trained professionals. In the case of the defendant, the police are able to apprehend him and his associates at the motel without significant delay or any repercussions. Furthermore, while real-time location is protected under the Fourth Amendment, historical location data does not enjoy that same privilege or the same established definition. And as per the court, location data can be historical as long as it is not followed in real time. Therefore, one can no longer consider where they have been to be privileged information, as that information is recorded by their cell phone provider, which can subsequently be accessed by the police. In addition, it is important to note that a proper definition cannot be established without a Supreme Court ruling. So whether or not a slight delay of 5 to 7 minutes can be considered historical or not is entirely in the air, so to speak. This case is only one in the grand legal spectrum of Fourth Amendment cases that must be deliberated and properly defined in the coming future. State v. Terrell is another case regarding the Fourth Amendment, in particular the private search doctrine. The case begins with defendant Terrell's significant other bringing a thumb drive containing a sexually explicit photo of a minor to the police. The police, under the Fourth Amendment, conducted a routine preliminary search to determine the validity of the claim. However, the next day, the police conducted a follow-up search on the thumb drive and found far more incriminating evidence, and used that as evidence to obtain a warrant to examine the full contents of the thumb drive. The defendant Terrell in trial court moved to suppress the information garnered by the warrant as a result of the follow-up search, as he believed it had violated his Fourth Amendment rights, prohibiting unreasonable searches. The trial court ruled that the follow-up search and the search warrant were lawful under the private search doctrine and then sentenced him justly. However, when he appealed, the Court of Appeal remanded the decision and ruled that the trial court had erred in ruling that the follow-up search and the search warrant that it was based on were not lawful. This case is novel in terms of how it applies the private search doctrine to follow-up search on an already searched private storage electronic device. In terms of this case, the private search doctrine did not allow the police to search the thumb drive for contents the defendant's significant other did not find herself. Therefore, the case was already limited based on what the significant other had found in the first place. In terms of warrants, this case demonstrates the limitations of warrants in North Carolina in determining culpability of an individual. Furthermore, unlike the prior case where warrants expand the police power, this case limits their power and in a way serves as a reminder to the police to adhere to the limitations of the Fourth Amendment as well as the private search doctrine. Fourth Amendment rights are becoming increasingly important as much of a person's private information is stored in quite a publicly accessible manner. Cases such as State v. Terrell are important in how they regard further specification and limitation in how private information can be accessed from a legal standpoint, as well as how it may be used in court to convict an individual. These cases and corresponding limitations are becoming increasingly important as society progresses and adopts new technologies. Real-time tracking and information retrieval are novel technologies and thus require similarly novel legislation and precedent to limit their use to only what is within reasonable justification.
State v. Salderna is a case that went up to the North Carolina State Supreme Court about what kind of rights juveniles have during the questioning process. So in this case, Salderna asked to call his mom while he was being questioned, and then he later moved ahead and signed a waiver of his rights. So the trial court concluded that he knowingly and intentionally waived his rights, and in North Carolina, those juvenile Miranda rights also include the presence of a parent or guardian. The court later held that he needed an unambiguous invocation of his right to have a parent present at questioning in order to actually have his mom there at the questioning. So this is the same standard that adults are held to when asking for a lawyer to be present during questioning, which means that in this respect, both juveniles and adult offenders all need to be able to unambiguously invoke their right to have a lawyer, or in the case of juveniles, a parent present at their questioning. So this decision is centered around the idea of totality of circumstances, which means that age alone doesn't mean an offender knows he was waiving his rights. You have to consider all of the factors, whether he expressed that he understood what his rights were, whether he was read a copy of his rights, whether he received a written copy of his rights, and whether the detective questioning him explained those rights before moving forward during questioning. So this case kind of created this idea that juveniles are still considered competent enough to make a knowledgeable decision about waiving their Miranda rights and the additional right to have a parent or guardian present at questioning. And moving forward, it's important to understand that the way that this case impacts our future legal work is that if your client were to demonstrate that there was some kind of concern during the process, like maybe not just age, but perhaps they weren't given a copy of their Miranda rights, or they weren't given a copy in a language that they can understand, when you combine all of those circumstances together with age, that could potentially prove that someone did not knowingly and intentionally waive their rights, but just being a minor, just being a juvenile offender, does not constitute enough of a basis for saying that he didn't intentionally waive his Miranda rights. Malvo v. Mathena is a case that reached the United States Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals having to do with a juvenile's rights in sentencing and understanding what kind of sentences can be applied for a juvenile based on earlier decisions regarding the Eighth Amendment. So Malvo was charged with 2 counts of capital murder and 2 counts of attempted capital murder, and he received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, a few years later, the Supreme Court ruled that under the Eighth Amendment, juveniles cannot be sentenced to death, and life without parole can only be imposed in a very few cases of rare juvenile offenders that reflect some kind of permanent incorrigibility, meaning that those juveniles really do need to be kept off the streets and there is no possibility of rehabilitation or to reform them and bring them back into society. And then based on this Supreme Court decision, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals later vacated his original sentence and then remanded his case to the lower court to determine which side his case falls into, whether his crimes reflect permanent incorrigibility or whether they reflect the transient immaturity of youth, in which case he's entitled to a lesser sentence because in that case that shows that he can be reformed, returned to society, and the sentence needs to be focused on rehabilitation rather than a purely punitive basis. So the key takeaway from this case is that dichotomy between whether a juvenile offender committed this crime because of some kind of immaturity of youth and could potentially grow out of this, could potentially be trained, re-educated, and brought back into society, or whether there is some kind of permanent issue that will prevent the juvenile from ever being able to return and participate in a beneficial manner in society. So when looking at sentencing for juveniles in serious capital crimes, defense attorneys should consider the evidence and reasoning that would reflect this kind of transient immaturity for youth. So that includes how young they were, what kind of crime it was, whether it was involved with other juveniles, or whether it's some kind of more deep-seated issue. And while this case doesn't directly apply to a guilty or not guilty verdict in a trial court, it will continue to govern the sentencing process, which is an integral part of criminal procedures, particularly for juveniles. Criminal law represents a contract between individuals and society, and when people commit a crime, they're harming this contract that individuals have agreed upon with their society. And in order to properly execute that contract, we need a judicial system, and we need that system itself to be bound to a set of rules that we've also agreed on in order to protect defendants, victims, and this essential contract. And these rules that bind our judicial system are the laws that comprise what we know as criminal procedure. For example, Miranda rights, juvenile rights, and warrants all dictate how individuals are treated by our system. They are the answers to the questions surrounding how we treat suspects and investigate crimes. Court jurisdiction is our society's answer to the question of what limits should be placed on our judicial system to investigate and to prosecute, in order for us to achieve a fair and consistent standard in our criminal proceedings. The cases mentioned in this presentation have all served to modify those rules. As we understand more about how defendants interpret the criminal system, we are better able to understand whether someone thinks they're being questioned and whether they feel like they are able to invoke their rights, for example. As lawyers, in order for us to represent our clients in the best way possible, we need to be able to gauge our clients' understanding of criminal procedure and to determine whether they were brought into the criminal justice system in a fair and equitable way. And as we've learned through many of these cases, the totality of circumstances approach is kind of the new standard for this kind of judgment. It represents not just a defendant's age, but all the other factors that could cloud someone's understanding of what their rights are and could cloud their understanding of what situation they think they're in. Do they think they're in an interrogation, or do they think these are just a few questions that will have no bearing on a legitimate trial? We also need to understand if the courts have handled cases in an equally equitable manner, if the warrants have been issued fairly, if the court even has a jurisdiction and has followed the procedural rules to begin with. And deviations from criminal procedure, especially on the side of the courts, can result in unfair trials, which ultimately corrupts our society's ability to enforce the rule of law. We hope that you've all learned about the updates to criminal procedure within the state of North Carolina and the Fourth Circuit Court, and will adapt your strategies accordingly, as abiding to criminal procedure in our legal strategies and its many changes is what prevents cases from being dismissed, judgments from being vacated, and the guilty from being able to walk free.